let's start with our animation crash course, and since animation is really a vast subject, I cannot really show you something in depth, but I will show you the basic concepts, ideas, and workflows behind the animation techniques in this lesson, and I'm pretty sure it will be more than good enough to get you going and prepare you for following lessons. Now, I understand that among you folks there are individuals which are versed into animation concepts and techniques, but still stay around for this lesson just to refresh your memory or maybe even learn something new. For newcomers and people that are not really into animation, this is pretty much essential, and it is a prerequisite for what is about to happen in next lesson. So if you want to animate something in Cinema 4D, you will use this timeline, and also an expanded version of this, the animation layout, which controls the full timeline, but we will talk about this a little bit later. So what can we animate inside Cinema 4D? Well, the answer is pretty much everything. Now, if you take a look at this icon group, it is 5 basic categories of what you can animate. So you can animate position, scale, rotation, parameters, and points. Points are off by default, and the points are really referred to points on an object. So you can animate points moving and stuff like that. So let's actually create a simple object that will help us follow this lesson, and maybe I will put this to 1 just for this object to be a little bit less distracting, and I'm pretty sure you can understand that position, scale, and rotation can be recorded. So the state change of any of those guys can be recorded, and that recorded value is simply called a keyframe, and I will refer to it as such from now on. And a little bit more abstract category is this parameter. So just to be on the simple side, this stuff here, for example, this inner radius, outer radius, segments, these are parameters. So any set of parametric controls for any object, or in fact anything that has this little gizmo here, this little circle inside Cinema 4D, and for example, these coordinates also are parameters, and they also contain this little gizmo, and everything that contains this little gizmo indicates that it can be animated. So these icons here actually give you an ability if any of those given categories will be recorded or not if you create a keyframe. So I really hope that makes sense, and you can see that point level animation is disabled by default. Now, the obvious question, how do I record a state change or a keyframe? Well, you do that with this icon group. So the first guy is manual recording, so you have to click on this guy to record a state change. This next guy is automatic keyframing, which simply indicates that it will automatically record anything we do, any changes we do. And this last guy is really not that important in this situation because it really refers to a selection object, so you can pretty much disregard that guy at this stage. Now let's first go with automatic keyframing. So if I enable this, notice that we get a red boundary line around our viewport, which indicates we are in automatic recording mode, and any change I do now will be recorded. So let's see if that is the case. So if we will move this guy, let's say in this direction, then we should expect this state to be recorded. Now nothing happened, at least in this timeline, and what you would expect from this guy is that you get a recorded value, a keyframe, and keyframes are little blue gizmos that will pop up on the position where you recorded your change of state. So let's actually scrap time here and bring back this guy roughly to the middle. So let's say something like this, and notice we have 2 of these guys now. So why did it add 2 keyframes? it added 2 keyframes because that's the way how automatic keyframing works. So we were at the frame 0 here and our object was here. Then we moved the time to frame 45 and went back to the center of the scene. So we changed position, we changed one of these values and it simply recorded that. So you have to be aware of that because in automatic keyframing mode, you can get extra keys or accidentally record keys on another, possibly undesired location. Now, one thing to understand is, although we only changed position values, we also got a keyframe for scale and rotation. This is simply how it works, and I will show you later that we have individual recorded keyframes for both scale and rotation, even though we did nothing in terms of scaling or rotating. Here is one more concept that you have to understand if you want to successfully animate, and that is if you move the object now, even though it has a keyframe, this little blue guy here, on the same time, it will simply override and use only the last one. That is simply a logical thing to do. Now, if we press play here, we will see our object happily traveling within that 2 keys. So everything between the keys is interpolated because it would be really stupid if we would have to record every single key for every single frame. That would be really tedious. Now, do note that you can select these keys here in the timeline and simply shift them. For example, let's say here, and press play. And even though you saw the object moving backwards, it had to do so to assume new interpolated position because the key now is on this frame 90. So that is one concept that you have to understand. And notice that our object is traveling slower. The position values are completely the same, but we are simply now cutting down the time for this object to travel from this point to this point. So in order to do so, it has to travel faster. So we effectively changed the timing of our animation. So let's show this concept a little bit further. Now it has more time to travel from point A to point B. Of course, if we set this to a last frame, it has even more time to reach that position on the last frame. I hope this makes sense. This is really a fundamental stuff that I'm showing you. So let's go back. Let's say that we want to start from scratch. So how would you delete all these keys? Well, simply here in the timeline, you can hit Ctrl A and simply hit delete. This will get rid of all the keys, and this became light gray simply because I defined a selection. I will show you this next once we will use this manual mode. So let's exit this automatic mode. And if you shift click here, just above, you will deselect anything in the timeline. Of course, if you simply click and hold and drag, you will create a selection within a timeline. So shift click just above it to deselect it. Let's go back and let me now show you this manual keyframing, which I prefer. And notice that for example, in this case, when you want to record something for your object, that object has to be selected. So you have to instruct the system which object to use. So now this icon is grayed out, and immediately if you select this object or any other object, it will become available. Now, what this means is if you hit this little guy or simply press F9 shortcut, you will add a keyframe on the location of this green guy. So that is really important. So let's create a simple animation. Let me just doodle quickly what I had in mind. So let's say that we want this guy to travel from here to, let's say, maybe here, and then to this position. So something like that. It doesn't have to be perfect naturally. So let's select it, and so again, it's much better to hit F9 than to constantly go back and forth here. So let's hit F9, and we created a keyframe. So let's scrub our time here roughly to half, or exactly half. And let's move our guy, and notice no keyframes will happen simply because we are now keyframing manually. So let's hit F9. Here is our curve, and let's go to frame 90, our last frame, and simply move our object roughly where we said we wanted to, and once again record the keyframe with F9. So you can see that we have a curve now instead of a linear spline, and I will explain that a little bit later in this lesson. So let's press play and see what we have now, and once again our object is happily traveling between three recorded states. So this key here, this middle one here, and this third one at the last. And what I wanted to show you here is that you can select parts of your timeline, which will then include all keyframes. So for example, if you simply click and hold and drag like this, we'll simply select both of these guys. Now you can now move them. You see it will automatically update in the viewport to indicate how interpolation will change. So let me show you that concept we talked about in this situation. So let's press play. And I think you understand what I mean. So now between these two keys there is a tiny bit of space, so it has to really go fast here to make this transition to the next key. Okay, so if we put this back in original position, then it will have a lot of time, and it will uniformly, relatively speaking, because there is a difference here, it will uniformly travel between the keys. Now let me stop this, go back. Let me now talk about this area here, which is called power slider, and I deliberately skipped this area with these standard controls, which you can find on any DVD player or similar device, and I'm pretty sure you are familiar with it. So let's talk about this power slider. Now what it does, I'll just shift click here to deselect anything that I have selected. It will be a little bit easier to understand. So it effectively limits the range. You can see you can drag ends of it. So now from frame 35 to 61, if I press play, it will limit its behavior, its playing time, only to that range. So this is really useful often. So let me stop this, go back. What is also useful is if you scale one end of this guy and press the Alt key, it will scale both sides proportionally. There is also a quick way to reset this guy. So if you hit Ctrl A, then you will expand to full time. Now the downside is it will select everything in the timeline. So you can maybe compensate that by shift clicking in here, or better idea is, let me show you. If you do a right click here, and actually I will have to just slightly increase, so you can see the command I'm accessing. So right click, expand to full time. So this is really neat and does the job perfectly. Now I really wish that this, all we talked about now, was pretty much all there is to it, but unfortunately it is not. We barely scratched the surface. Now, since animation is really a vast subject, you will soon see that 4D in Cine 4D really stands for a good reason, and therefore we will switch from our startup layout, our main layout, to animation layout. I will just use this one below. It's simply one that is resized to fit into recording area, and otherwise it is completely the same as this one. So let's switch, and at first glance you might be lost, but notice the complete timeline and power slider, and all that we have in standard layout is here, and here we have object manager, attribute manager, so it's all here but a little bit rearranged. And basically only thing that is new is this guy here. So this is the actual timeline, the bigger brother of this little one here. So this inside is called graph editor, and these blue guys here are actually the keys, exactly the same as these ones we made for this short animation. Now you may think that this area here is a lot of place for these few keys, but this actually has a really good reason, which I will show you in just a few moments. And first thing I want to show you is how to navigate this graph editor, this timeline. So basically it's really similar to navigation in viewport. So if you press the Alt key and use standard navigation techniques with the mouse buttons, you can zoom in and out, you can move the graph editor, and even shortcut keys work here. So if you press H here, let me just move it a little bit. So H, it will frame all time to fit into this graph editor area. There are also other shortcuts that work here, and I strongly encourage you to remember them because they will really make your life easier while you are navigating this timeline and graph editor. So for example, if you select something, if you select a certain key, let's say this one, let's shift this just a little bit so I can show you what it does. If you press the S key, it will frame to selected. On the other hand, let's hit H to frame all. If you scrub this little guy, you see it's exactly the same as this one, and press O, you will frame to that current position of that green scrubber. So once again, frame. So that is very useful. Of course, this is the power slider bar, exactly the same as this one. So you can move it also here in the timeline, and let's shift this key back to frame 90 like this. So obviously you can make selections here, you can add to selection, move these keys, rearrange stuff, and pretty much anything that pops to your mind. So let's hit H and frame all. Now what I want to show you is that you probably noticed that your disk object is listed here, and if you press this little plus sign, you will access its tracks, and every recorded key for any single value, whether it is position, scale, rotation, parameter, or point level animation, will receive its own individual track. Now you can expand all these guys and access individual recorded keys for every single axis. And let me now show you the downsides of this automatic keyframe and manual keyframing. And notice that we recorded actually only the position values for our disk object, but still, because these guys were enabled, this rotation and scale, we also got recorded keys for rotation and scale, even though nothing changed in regard to scale or rotation. Now that's the downside of these two recording mode, and I will show you one preferred method that I often use later in the lessons, but for the time being, when there is no actual change for the keys that are recorded, freely select them and simply delete them. So nothing will change because we only work with position values. Now let me stop this, go back. So always optimize and delete unnecessary keys. So in fact, you can go even a step further, because as far as the position is concerned, we only have animation in X and Z. So we can freely delete Y. So select Y and simply delete it. And just to prove that everything is alright. So to work efficiently, you have to have minimal amount of data. Let me show you just a little interesting thing. If we press play, you really don't want to catch this guy and then try to move it forward and backward, just to establish if a certain part of animation is really as you want it to. You can in fact leave it to be playing all the time, and if you hit the J key, you can simply then move regardless of your cursor position. So that's really useful because you don't have to play catch with that guy. So I really think this will help you a lot in scrubbing the time and overall working with timeline. Okay, so let's stop this, go back. Now I want to explain what these guys mean. So these little icons indicate that track is active. So for example, if we turn off this Z, position Z recorded keys, watch what happens. It simply doesn't take this recorded Z position into account. This is really important. So of course there is another little dot next to it, which means solo this track. So if I click this guy, then only recorded keys for this track will be taken into account. Everything else will be ignored. Stop this, go back. Aside to that, there is also an option. For example, if you click this guy, you can add to a new layer and simply organize things a little bit better. Now, this is not the end of the line, and we can go even a step further. And for that purpose, I will simply delete this position Z, because I think it will be much easier to understand on a single track rather than having few of them. So this little arrow sign, if I click on it, I can access the curve, and this curve, it's kind of difficult to see, so that's why there is a dedicated curve only mode for any given track. So while this position X is selected, you can switch to this curve mode, this F curve mode, by clicking this guy or simply by tapping spacebar. And just to mention, if you hit the spacebar again, you will be back into key mode. So this is really useful. So by clicking this guy, you will cycle through available timeline mode. So let's go to F curve mode and select that position X and hit H key to frame all. Now I deliberately left only X position recorded track because then it would be easy to distinguish that this curve here and this curve here, which is actually an animation path, are not the same. So this curve presents something else. And what it presents is the interpolation of motion between your keys. And these little guys, you see I'm selecting them, are the actual keys. So you can move them around and do anything you want to them, just as in the key mode. But I actually prefer this F curve mode because it is much more powerful and versatile. Now I will hit play, but you'll notice that nothing will happen. And the reason for it is we didn't do anything wrong. Simply when I was deleting the other track, which was left to be soloed, system remembered that. So it's pretty much ignoring all other tracks. So I can simply hit this guy 2 times just to refresh the system. So now everything will work as expected. So let me stop this, go back, and I will try to explain you a simple concept so you can understand the principles of interpolation much easier. Let's hit play. So notice how my object at the beginning of the animation, it accelerates slowly, then it picks up the speed and travels pretty much in linear fashion until here, and it slows down into this point. that is exactly what this curve describes. Let me stop this. Now, notice this key. If I delete this key, I'm pretty sure it will have insignificant effect on the overall motion. So let's delete it and tell me if you can see the difference. I'm pretty sure you can. So now we have nice and smooth, soft interpolation between the curves. If I right click here, I will get a menu which contains some spline types and various interpolations. Now, for this to be accessible, I have to select the keys. So let's hit Ctrl A and simply select maybe linear interpolation. Let's see what happens. So press play now and notice how we get a straight line now, which indicates completely linear movement. Now, this guy is traveling in linear continuous fashion from point A to point B, so between these two keyframes. We also have step interpolation, and this will be a little bit weird. So basically there is no interpolation between keys, so there are just abrupt changes. So take a look what will happen now. So it stays on the same position and it just abruptly assumes this one at frame 90. So let's get back to our spline interpolation. This is the default type of interpolation if you want fluid movement and smooth interpolation between keys. Now, you probably noticed these guys here, and those are tangents, which I'm sure you are familiar with from this Bezier spline. And in fact, this F curve is a Bezier spline itself. And let me show you a simple concept. So let's select this key and move this guy down. So now what will happen? Let's press play and explain while it will be happening. So I think you get the picture. Now this object starts to travel from its original key position and it tries to maintain the value of this key until roughly here. Let me just use the J key. Once again, it travels, it tries to maintain that value, then it slowly picks up the speed, and once it reaches roughly this position, it has to speed up considerably to reach this position within this given time frame. So I hope this concept is clear enough. So let me show you complete opposite effect. So now it has to travel fast and then it has to slow down to reach this key slowly. Now, this can be a little bit difficult to understand because you're not actually modifying the key values here. The recorded states are completely the same. You're just modifying the interpolation between the keys. I really hope this makes sense. So, for example, let's add another key here. Let's control click here in the middle. And if we move this guy, you will see that you get the feedback in the viewport, but that can be a little bit misleading what these curves actually do. Now, let's press play and see what happens. Well, simply nothing. What we did now is we actually added a keyframe at value minus 16.611 at X. I hope that makes sense. So this key has this value, which you can read here also in the attribute manager at frame 44. So if we move this tangent like this, let's frame all now, let's see what will happen. And it will travel back. Why is it traveling back? It's traveling back because we told it so. Let's scrap this guy, so I will explain this while dragging this guy. So currently we are at first key. So we are here, we are progressing through time, and roughly here, at this position here, and throughout this part of the curve, we are going over the value of a keyframe. And by over, I mean a larger value than it is set for this key. So currently this is roughly minus 16, and here let's hover over the curve, and you can see that this value here is roughly around 44. You can see this here, or if I hover long enough, it will appear under my cursor. Now that means, in this case, since we are working with position X, this means that interpolation will tell that object at this point to reach 43 centimeters on X axis. I really hope this makes sense. Now we are traveling once again further, and this key instructs this object to go back to minus 16. So that is why here we have an overshoot. This is a classic example. So now this can often be desirable effect, but what if you don't want that? What if you want to pull this guy and simply drop all this interpolation below the key value? Now you can do this visually like this, so it's below this key value, so something like this, but you will of course affect the other side. Let me undo that, and if you don't want to affect the other side, you can break the tangents. So if you hold the shift key, and you won't be able to break them if this keep visual angle is on, so you have to disable that. So if you hold the shift key, you can break the tangent and work with only single side. So let's try something like this and hit play. Let's see what happens. And it once again goes backwards in certain moment, and that is because of this side. Let's now pull this side like this, and we will have a little bit of an odd behavior. Now why is that? If you take a closer look here, so you can zoom in actually, you can still see that this line is overshooting this key value. So we have to drop this below like this. Then you will have just a slight hiccup, and then it will continue. I'm showing you this because with just a few keys you can define very complex movements. So something like this, and we have only 3 keys in our scene. You can expand it just a little bit more, so maybe something crazy like this. And how about this motion? This is certainly not something you could think you could achieve with just 3 keys. Now, there is also a multitude of tools here, so let's talk about some of them. Maybe this clamp value means that new keys that you create with control clicking won't suffer from that overshoot problem we discussed now, so they will tend to stay. So I'm adding new keys, they will tend to interpolate properly, so without overshoot. I hope that makes sense. Now we could mention auto tangents. So if you hit auto tangents, it will simply create an automatic default nice interpolation. Let me undo that. And for that matter, you can simply select all keys, right click, and here under spline types, there are some of spline presets for your convenience. So for example, is the default one. We can get rid of this key maybe, and this is the default curve you will get when you will be recording keys. Now, if you hit Ctrl D, you will get project settings here, and you can set the default interpolation type for your keys. And I'm pretty sure you want to leave this at spline, but just in case you can set it to whatever you want here. Now there are a lot of things in these menus here, and we will cover some of them as we will progress through this training. And let me just tell you a thing or two that I think that would be really useful. So for example, if you create a new key or select any given key, if you hold the shift key, you will constrain the movement on a single axis. So now I can only move this guy up or down. Same goes if you once again select the shift key and move it left to right. So in whatever movement you start, you will constrain to only that axis if you hold the shift key. So we could also mention markers. So for example, let's say that you want to mark this area here for future reference. So by adding this little guy here, you will get this yellowish gizmo, and you can rename it and add notes here. So for example, here you could type this is my special tangent and add markers to simply mark something interesting or relevant in your timeline. Now, the problematic part with these guys is once you select it and you hit delete key, nothing will happen, and you can accidentally delete keys just as I did now. So let me undo this, and to delete this guy, because this can drive you insane, you simply click on it, hold it and drag it either a little bit upwards or downwards until this trash can icon appears, and once you release it will be gone. So I think this is really useful, and those markers are often used when you have complex animations or you're doing walk cycles or stuff like that. Now let me show you the preferred way how I animate and record keys in Cina for this. So let's go back to our startup layout. Of course, this is completely the same, just resized to fit into recording area. And we will start from scratch here. So instead of selecting all here in the timeline, you can also delete the animation values by simply finding the animated value, and everything that has this little dot here aside to it can be animated. And if you right click on it, you can go animation, delete track. This will delete everything from within that track. Now I really prefer to do my keyframes here, so let me just select X here, and the reason why I prefer this is because it only keyframes what I want. It doesn't add keyframes for every single position value or rotation value or scale value, and it really keeps things nice and clean. So let's go roughly to the first position. So once again, that control click idea works here. So control click this little guy, go roughly to the end of time, something like this, and notice that this guy is now colored with this yellowish orange color, which means that this value has been animated, but you are not on a keyframed value. So we can add another key here, control click. So now we have the same thing. So simple, basic animation. The advantage of it, and you really don't have to go into animation layout. You can simply right click here, and under animation, you can choose show track, and you will get a dedicated window for only this keyframed value. Now, what is important to understand, let me show you, is that now we didn't get all these scale and rotation values, which are recorded once you're using manual keyframing or automatic keyframing. So that is why I prefer to work with these single values. What is also important, regardless of these guys being disabled, if you do keyframes with this method, then it overrides this setting. So let me clear the track once again, delete track. So to demonstrate, We can add a keyframe here, go to the end of the timeline, maybe move this guy a little bit and add a key like this. So we have our animation, although these guys are disabled, because this method overrides everything. Hope that is clear enough. Now let me show you which shortcuts work here also, and you already know with control clicking you're adding keyframes, but with shift clicking you're deleting at the specific place of this scrubber guy. So let's add a key here, and if I shift click it will remove that key, so anything that is under this guy will be removed. Let's just demonstrate this. If I shift click now, nothing will happen, simply because there is no key here. Now, if I want to delete everything, regardless of the position of this guy on this track, I can simply hold down the shift and control key and click, and it will get rid of everything. This is exactly the same as this delete track command, so nice shortcut. So that's it. That was our animation crash course, and I sincerely believe this demystified animation inside Cinema 4D a bit, and that even newcomers now have all the knowledge to follow this training efficiently. Now, please do note that animation is vast subject and that we only scratch the surface, and my intention here was to show you some basic concepts and workflows so you can build on that knowledge and follow the later lessons. Now let's dive into our character/builder object in our next lesson.